honored ambassadors, and amazing delegates. I could go with something more formal to explain what I've seen today, but I'm actually going to go pretty real and raw and to say that this really has been inspirational and amazing to see the people that have been here today. And for me personally, because 12 years ago, I went, a very young lady, after my Israeli military service, and I got on a plane and I went to Washington, and I spent months in an internship in a think tank. Members here today come from all walks of the different variations of think tanks in Africa and the Middle East, Europe and America. And what I've seen here today is different than what I saw 12 years ago. Because 12 years ago, it didn't take me very long to realize that that was not where I wanted to be in life. I did not believe that think tanks were going to bring the policy changes or solutions that my region, as a young entrepreneur in the Middle East, was going to bring. And today I stand corrected for sure. I've been among people who are showing courage and bravery and doing, actually acting to make change in our region, for your own countries, for our countries together, for collective regions. And it really is inspiring to see everyone here leading by example. But 12 years ago, when I came back from that experience, I decided that my place was not among the think tanks, that it was in business. And I love on our last panel that someone said the young people will come, but it will be from a business point of view. And I came back and I opened my first company. Since then, I've had a number of companies here in Israel that have dealt with impact, meaning I'm an impact entrepreneur. I create businesses because I believe that they serve a purpose and that the purpose can be delivered by the private sector. And so today, we're going to be talking a lot about the relationships and the collaboration that we can create as think tanks, as do tanks, as governments, but also it's an honor to be the voice of the entrepreneurs in this room today. There's a very vast sector of business, and it runs through the DNA of all of our countries. It creates the backbone of our economies. And without that voice, it's possible that these conversations today will never actually be complete. And so it's exciting to be here, and my panelists today are going to give a very interesting approach to how we can deal with one of the biggest challenges in the economic sector today and how it relates to national security, food security, water security, and the potential for prosperity in all of our countries. And so thank you to you all for joining and for dealing with my complete shenanigans up to this panel. We've had intense discussions, the four of us, over the past week. And so it's very exciting to get started. Can we get these slides on the screen? So when Yechiel reached out to me and he said he wants me to do a panel at this conference, he said, "What would you do it on?" And without blinking, I said ESG. And he blinked 3 times and looked at me and he said, "What?" And today, I love it that when the panel came on for us to vote, the first thing was, what's ESG? And so I think that that's great. That's a great place to start. But before we get into what is ESG, I thought that we could all just take a little bit of entertainment after our lunch break and look at this complex process that everyone in this room deals with every day. We collect data, hopefully turn that into information, somehow connect the dots to create knowledge. Our jobs are to create insights from that will eventually lead to wisdom that will be turned into policy and actions will be put forward. If we do a really good job, we keep the conspiracy theories at bay. But I'm sure everyone in this room's been in the business long enough to know that that doesn't always happen, and sometimes we have to deal with those as well. So earlier, many of you, not all of you, but many of you went into our live poll. And I have the results here, so let's check them live. We still have a tie. The question is ESG currently considered a burden or an opportunity in African commodity markets? 31% of the voters said it's a burden, 31% of the voters said opportunity, and 38% said both. You guys may be all a little too political, those that answered both. I'd like to know why. But by the end of this session, hopefully we'll have some better answers as well. So, let's start with data. Breathe deep. It's a lot of data. Don't worry, you don't need to read this. It's simply an example of what an ESG report looks like today. This is an example of a Swiss insurance company. They abide by indicators that we call SASB, S-A-S-B. But what is ESG actually? Environmental, social, and governance compliance. Essentially, the world today expects companies, public or private, in many cases it's voluntary, but in many cases it's now becoming mandatory, to abide by measuring these indicators across environment, social activity, and their internal governance. If I simplify that data and try to turn that into some information for you, this is essentially what a corporate has to deal with. I always try to put myself in the shoes of why this is happening. Why are companies demanding from their entire supply chain, much of which is across the countries we represent here today, to comply with these measurements? Why are farmers all of a sudden being asked about deforestation, and if they can commit that they're not adding to the negative effects of deforestation? Why are cocoa farmers in Ghana being asked to confirm that they have no child labor practice? What seems to be a simple question on an indicator list in Europe is a very loaded issue in many of our economies. Then I look a little bit deeper and I say, if it's not mandatory yet, why are you doing it? Why don't you just stick with measuring your own house? Your headquarters in Philadelphia, maybe your branches in London? Why are we going all the way down to the specific water levels used on farms across Africa? This example will show you exactly why. Once these companies measure and report on ESG, like that very complex document that you saw before, they're then rated and ranked. And if we want to talk about opportunity and economy, there are over 600 entities in the world today that will report and rank a company as a third-party asset. The company has no say, except for that one report that they put out. Big deal. So someone says something about your company. They've given you a rank. Well, it is a big deal, because that rank goes straight into the stock market, to investor reports and recommendations, and directly to your stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, environmental and social issues through ESG compliance are now tied directly to the performance indicators of corporations around the world. So the CEOs and the CSOs, Chief Sustainability Officers, which is a rising career due to these indicators, now report daily, weekly, quarterly, annually to stakeholders on how their company's doing and making sure that they leave the people and the planet in an okay or better situation than when they first came in. So I want you to take a moment, and just like they would teach you at university in conflict resolution, take a moment to step back and put yourself in the shoes of an international CEO today. Imagine how difficult it is to run a company, to produce a product or a good, a service. Now add on top of that a whole layer of key performance indicators that have nothing to do with their financial bottom line. I've spoken to companies that say, we just make drinks in a can. Why are you talking to me about the energy that I use to do it, or the waste that comes out of my factories after the product is made? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking about it all day. And so if I change that information into something that's even easier to understand, and now we may be getting closer to terminology that we're all familiar with, This is a list of the same indicators that I showed in that very complex table before, of the issues, the categories of ESG. We have in here things such as environment, greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, energy management, water and wastewater management, waste management, ecological. If you go over to social, human rights, community relations, customer privacy, access and affordability, human capital, labor practices, employee health and safety. Can anyone in this room tell me, if we take that CEO hat off and put our national research institution hats back on, some of those topics that I just mentioned sound familiar to you? Because there's another set of indicators and frameworks that we're much more familiar with. Can anyone guess what I'm referring to? Give you a really big hint. The SDGs. When people say ESG, I know that I need to say environmental, social, and government to explain. But when I say SDG, everyone in this room knows what I'm talking about. The Sustainable Development Goals have been on our tables in our policy institutions for many, many, many years. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll simplify the process and explain that ESG is built on the same science as SDG. And those of us that have been around for long enough know that before SDG, it was called something else. And then there was also CSR, and then there was sustainability reports, and there's about 100 other acronyms that we can put on the table. But in the end of the day, it's based around the same science, and that is, what are we as peoples, as corporations, as nation groups doing to make sure that our countries are sustainable, that our people are prosperous, and that we're leaving opportunity for the future. So every ESG indicator can be traced to an SDG. And this is where some insights will start flowing. This is a correlation map of every SDG, all 17 of them, and how many times they're mentioned across the ESG issues. The biggest ones being 3, 8, 12, and 16, with a close follow of 10, 11, 14, and 15. So what does all of that actually mean? Through ESG, for the first time in modern history, corporations are 100% aligned with national agendas to move forward with national goals to ensure environmental and social justice, equality, and prosperity. Good health, well-being, decent work, economic growth, responsible consumption and production, peaceful, strong institutions, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, care for water and care for land. The indicator codes may be different, but don't let them confuse you. The ESGs are SDGs for companies. So is it such a bad thing that companies are now going to be held a little more accountable in our countries to push these things forward from their own budgets? That's always a big question when we're going to do anything in developing any country. Who's paying? Who's doing? Who's responsible for what? And whoever pays normally has a say. But I have a question, and we're going to try to answer it today on this panel. Who should be driving this discussion? Who should be paying? Who should be doing? I think a creative solution is in effect here. Because what you may not know yet about ESG is that the environmental and social indicators alone are expected to be roughly a $72 trillion market. These numbers have gone back and forth on the businesses, on the governments. Blue here in the chart representing businesses, orange representing governments. Notice how it's almost equal, with a small area of gray on top of philanthropic finances. To give some comparison to what that is, the 2019, unfortunately I didn't have other updated numbers, 2019 GDP of Africa was in the gray next to it. However, I come from the business world, so I want to use a business term here. When I think Africa in the term of ESG, I think scope 3. I think supply chain. I think commodities. I think the goods and services that make up the backbone of the corporations. And those finances might make up the backbone of African economy. But this is a give and take relationship. And this new market could be the largest financial market that our continents have actually ever experienced. So what exactly are we going to do about it? Is it a burden to comply? Or is it possible that this is an opportunity that everyone in this room should be able to know not to miss? Is it an opportunity where we can say, as Scope 3, as companies' biggest burden, the supply chain, this is how we in our countries are going to meet these indicators, because we've been doing it for a long time and we know what's needed. In the collaborations in this room and what was discussed today, we can even collectively come up with the technology and the solutions for them. They exist, but they need to be implemented. And I think that opens up for exactly discussion today. And I want to utilize the rest of our time to not only have a discussion on the panel, but I challenge each one of the tables in front of me. Utilize what you have, this opportunity. You have brilliant minds sitting around the table with you. Why doesn't every table take out a piece of paper, get a volunteer from one of the delegates, and start jotting down ideas on how your country could capitalize on this economic opportunity that's coming your way? What solutions could you implement? What policy could you put on the table to help your supply chain deal with the compliance indicators that are coming in? And in case you missed it in the first slide, right now it's voluntary. But come 2025, many of these indicators will be mandatory across the board. And when it does become mandatory, and corporations will have no choice but to comply with these measurements, ask yourself also what that will mean for your country, and if you were ready for it, or if you ignored the early warning signs. So gentlemen, are you ready to give us some insights that are going to lead to some wisdom on this topic? So, as we're discussing, I want us to keep in mind, is it a burden? Is it an opportunity? What are the real challenges posed regardless? And what role can we play as research and policy institutions in helping ease and optimize this process? And the provocative question, what are the consequences if we do nothing? So I'll open the floor actually with Dr. Asembo of Kenya. You wrote a paper for this conference, and I would highly encourage everyone to take a look at it afterwards. I found it profound and very insightful. And you described in your paper the effect of the drought in the Horn of Africa and what's going on at the moment because of climate change in your region. The numbers to me were quite staggering of the negative impact and what it's caused. You refer to smart policy regimes and innovative technology. And after everything we've heard today and from your insights from your paper and your knowledge, could you share with us a little bit more about the models that you put forward and what the role the private sector investment can play in climate smart policy?
Thank you very much, Emily, for giving me this opportunity. I equally thank Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs for inviting me to Israel. Of course, as a young man growing up in rural Kenya, I remember my greatest dream was to visit Jerusalem, because my Sabbath school teacher made me believe that when a righteous man dies, the moment he's buried, his next destination is Jerusalem. So thank you very much. That's how close we are. I want to take this opportunity to briefly give a reflection on the food security situation in the Horn of Africa. And I want to emphasize that currently the Horn of Africa is undergoing a period of great drought. It's the worst drought in 40 years. And that has seen a lot of impact on food production, on livestock production, on fish and aquaculture. And this is occasioned by climate change, which a number of Horn of African countries are trying to respond to. But what we are saying is that amidst all these challenges, we do have massive opportunities in terms of the agricultural potential of the Horn of Africa. Today, when we do our calculations, we realize that only 7.7% of the land in the Horn of Africa is arable, and a massive 45.28% agriculturally productive land is not yet put under use. The internal renewable water resources actually stand at 78.7% annually. Horn of Africa has an average 500 millimeters of rainfall every year, and massive underground water, particularly the Turkana aqua resources that were discovered recently in Kenya. And so when we look at all these potential, it presents a massive opportunity for the private sector, especially in the agricultural supply chain. There are opportunities in the inputs, there are opportunities in the food processing, there are opportunities in post-harvesting, there are opportunities in marketing. But how do we ensure that as the private sector gets into the Horn of Africa, we must show responsible business conduct? And so what defines responsible business conduct in agricultural supply chain in the Horn of Africa? That is one question that we are asking. And I want to particularly focus on Kenya in terms of ESG compliance. And I want to situate my discussion on the fact that ESG compliance should define responsible business conduct in the agricultural supply chain in the Horn of Africa. Currently, the Constitution of Kenya, Article 69, as well as the Climate Change Act 2016, provide for protection of the environment. In the COP26, Kenya actually committed to net zero greenhouse emissions by 2030, and commitment to ensure 100% transition to green energy, clean cooking gas by 2028. The Capital Markets Authority in 2015 released guidelines on ESG compliance. The Central Bank of Kenya actually equally released the guidelines. And in 2017, Kenya banned the use of plastics in packaging. And this had great impact on the manufacturing sector that had to move into getting more friendlier packaging for their products. We equally have regulations that were recently issued by the Nairobi Securities Exchange that unveiled their disclosure manual in 2021 that required firms to be ESG compliant by the end of 2022. They were given a one-year window. Of course, the Kenya Bankers Association actually launched what we are calling the Green Bond Program that was encouraging firms to use the bond for ESG compliance. But all these are on top of other policies that have been developed by the government of Kenya on climate smart agriculture. Of course, we have our climate smart agriculture strategy 2017 to 2026. We have the Kenya agricultural policy. We have our the policy on the arid lands of Kenya. We have the fisheries policy. These are a raft of policies that have been put in place to ensure that there is responsible business conduct. Other firms and industry players have adopted the GRI. They've adopted the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board measures. We have the FCI Performance Index that have been put in place. All these are regulations to ensure that these farms remain ESG compliant. But the biggest question now is, are there consequences? Why is it important that we must compel compliance? I want to give a few case studies in terms of what has happened to the food security in Kenya. And one of them is that enforcing compliance has a role to play in biodiversity protection. Currently, Kenya in 2022 declared the mesquite plant, it's actually called the Matenge plant in Kenya, a threat to national security. Why? This is a plant that was introduced by the Kenya Kenya Institute of Forestry Research in 1970 to try and improve the ground cover in arid lands. To date, it has covered over 2 million acres of land in Kenya and is continuing to spread at the rate of 15% annually. What is it doing on biodiversity? Any other vegetation that grows under the Matenge plant disappears. Wherever the livestock get into contact with Matenge plant and eat its buds, they lose all their teeth. That is what the Matenge plant does. If it pricks you, the thorns, it's very poisonous, and it has a devastating impact on the health of people. The other case study that I can give is the water hyacinth that was introduced by the Belgian colonialists in Rwanda and Burundi as an ornamental plant. The water hyacinth is believed to be from Brazil, and it made its way into Lake Victoria. Now it has blocked Kisumu Port. A lot of resources are being used to work on it, and it is causing havoc and environmental hazards. It's killing fish because where it is, fish can't breed. The other example that I want to give is the dodder weed. It's called the Japanese dodder. The Japanese dodder is a plant that is, of course, causing havoc. We don't know how it entered into the country, but it now has a lot of hazards on avocados, on mangoes, and wherever it's a parasitic plant, very invasive. It covers the mangoes and then they just disappear. It makes sure that the plant which it covers definitely disappears and dries up. So I want to give the last example of the Nile perch in Lake Victoria. In 1929, of course, the British colonialists sent Michael Graham to Lake Victoria to do a research. And through their findings on Lake Victoria, it's called it Victoria Nyanza fisheries and its fisheries. Graham made a recommendation that the introduction of any large predator into the lake without adequate environmental impact assessment would have devastating impact on the indigenous species. These findings were supported by Worthington in 1929, who said that Graham's recommendations must be complied to. But in 1955, the Uganda Fisheries Game and Fisheries Department, led by one John Stoneman, decided to introduce Nile perch from Lake Albert. He actually picked 47 species and introduced them into Victoria Nile. And he picked another 100 species and introduced them into Lake Kyoga. Why was this done? The colonialists felt like, no, Lake Victoria has small fish species. Why should we have such a huge lake with some small fish species like the tilapia? And so they decided to introduce the Nile perch. That was in 1955. In 1979, we get the Nile perch boom. And the Nile perch boom actually moved many indigenous communities from the farms. Before then, a number of farms around Lake Victoria, a number of communities around Lake Victoria would till their land. When the Nile Perch boom came, they abandoned their farms and went to trade in Nile Perch. What did the Nile Perch do to Lake Victoria? It made sure that all the available indigenous species at that particular time were almost extinct. In fact, there are very few that are remaining. What happened later on? Today, there is overfishing of Nile Perch. But many of the indigenous communities lost their knowledge on food production. They are still fishing, going to fish for the Nile Perch. That is not there. You go to community around Lake Victoria, you see large and huge farmlands abandoned. In fact, there are farms which had been abandoned as early as 1979. They've never been tilled since 1979 during the Nile Perch boom. And that Nile Perch is no longer there. And the people keep on looking for Nile Perch, which is no longer there. And they cannot come back because of the loss of indigenous knowledge. And all this actually tell us that if we don't compel compliance, the devastating impact on biodiversity is huge. I want to again talk about the issue of resources efficiency. If we compel compliance, we are likely to see a lot of savings in terms of energy use, a lot of savings in terms of water conservation. I want us also to look at the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of gas emissions, in fact, 31% of greenhouse gas emissions are from the agricultural supply chain, from the livestock manure, from manure storage. If we compel compliance, we are likely to bring down the greenhouse emissions. If we compel compliance, we are likely to have an impact on waste management and pollution. These are areas that are causing devastating impact on food security in the Horn of Africa. Thank you.
Is this one working? Yes? There we go. Thank you, Dr. Asembo. And I think that goes a lot to many of the regulatory bodies have questioned, do we abide only by environmental or only by social indicators? And there is a very large pushback. And I think that I would just ask myself that if before, in the 1970s, African countries would have had the ability to enforce the compliance themselves, then something like that case you just mentioned potentially never would have happened. And a lot of these indicators have been built out of the case studies over the years from these types of incidences that environmental actions could have prevented social damage in a lot of our countries. Thank you. Dr. Ghedira, so you're coming to us from UAE and you also have a footstake out of Tunisia. And I'd like to hear both perspectives, not only both perspectives geographically, but both perspectives out of innovation. Your center does amazing work when it comes to innovation, what we call old school, and also new school. The AI revolution and what your work is doing is quite incredible, and I believe it's probably the next step and the next conference I'd like to explore that even further. But today, I'd like to hear some examples in your opinions around agriculture and water technology initiatives, and in general, what role innovation could play in the ESG process.
Thank you, Emily. So thank you, Emily. So if we put it in the context, let me start with the UAE first. First, I was fortunate to participate in UN Sustainability Conference 2012 in Rio, where the SDGs goals were developed, and I participated in a couple of working groups on some of SDGs. At that time, the debate was how the adaptation, because each country is different. We have many indicators that some of them are not relevant to some countries. And the challenge we're facing until now, the adaptation of this indicator to some specific countries. If I take the UAE as example and take the water energy nexus, because water energy nexus is explained differently in the UAE. And the idea of, the United Arab Emirates started the renewable energy program in late 2000, 2006, 2007. And that time, people are asking why oil-rich countries are investing in renewables. And that time, renewables were very expensive technology. In 2007, the first 100 megawatt plant CSP in the UAE, the kilowatt hour cost 32 cents. Just to compare to today's price, about 4 cents. I'm talking about CSP. The PV is third price compared to CSP because CSP gives you the option of storage of your energy. So the question of saving water in the UAE is not saving natural resources because 100% of water is coming from desalination. So saving water is saving energy because 1 liter of water can be converted to kilowatt hour. So this has changed completely the philosophy of saving natural resources by preserving water usage in both agriculture and for household. And this is bring the question of how we can give more incentive on saving water in households. At that time, the idea of investing in renewable energy for the UAE was around water, energy, food nexus, because the question how you can sustain life in arid environment, in desert environment after oil. So the idea at that time was if we have blessed to be positioned on the sand belt, very high solar resources, so if we can capture with efficient technology, solar resources, so we can use desalinate water. And we assume that seawater is infinite resources. No one will be concerned about saving seawater. So we can, if you manage to consume, desalinate, but more importantly is to manage to save the environment in terms of how you can discharge your brine and the high concentrate of saline water back to the environment. So if you produce water from sun and you can irrigate, so you can produce food and you can close the loop in terms of food, water, energy, food nexus. And this cannot be applied in other countries because it's why, to go back to my initial point, that it's country specific. You ask about some example. I give you an example of study that I participate in terms of using sewage, treated water for irrigation. And that time, if you take my initial point that liter of water is kilowatt hour, so we find out that instead of like collecting wastewater, sending to the sewage treatment plant, in general is outside the city, so you have to pump it like 30 to 50 kilometers out of the city, treated. All the water has to be treated anyway. So, but to add the tertiary treatment to make it usable for irrigation or for landscaping. So this is also additional cost. And then to pump it back to the same point, to landscape and irrigate, if you calculate the energy cost needed to pump it to the sewage treatment plant and pump it back as treated water for landscaping, you find out that the energy needed is much more what you need to desalinate water directly from the sea and use it for irrigation. So the question how you can take all those parameters into consideration in making those decisions and also in integrating them in some policies as well. So this is for you. I want to give you an example about Tunisia. Tunisia now is facing scarcity of water due to climate change, so the much less rain. But if you see the water consumption in Tunisia, 80% of the water is going to irrigation, 20% for industrial and household usage. So saving water, if you have to save water, you have more to invest in advanced technology in irrigation instead of thinking to add more expensive desalination technology to add 2 to 3% of water needs. Then you can easily save this one by implementing more efficient irrigation systems. We can use it also by fixing the pipeline because all pipeline, we have the leakage rate between 40 to 50% in some places, and it requires much less money to save instead of investing in very expensive technology. I agree that we need in some locations, some places, some small desalination unit to cover a specific area. So if you go to agriculture, I give an example about orange irrigation. So in Tunisia, 1 kilo of orange needs 500 liters of water. If you calculate the cost, if you benchmark your cost on desalination now, 1 meter cube of water, if you have efficient desalination technology, it will cost you between 0.8 and 0.9. This is the cost in North Africa, by the way, $1 per meter cube. So the cost of selling orange or exporting orange to Europe will be much less the cost of water if you benchmark your cost and what will cost you to desalinate water. So the question is how you can implement this on decision making. So we can make policy, but to go back to the ESGs and the implementation, the policy it's different. So this is just one example for how policies are important, how the full picture is important as well. I want to go back quickly to one about the collaboration with Israeli universities, because now in my role as the Director of Research Engagement at our university, I am coordinating many collaboration programs, and I am coordinating one of them is with Weizmann Institute, and we have very active collaboration with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem as well. You know, they have one of the more advanced school of agriculture, so in terms of innovation and the ecosystem surrounding the university are producing amazing technology, and we see how we can leverage in this knowledge. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We are, in some places, we are sharing similar environment in desert conditions, and how Israeli technology managed to leverage and take advantage and to develop innovative technology to make agriculture more efficient, so it can also benefit many other countries. So to answer now, Emily, your question about data and AI, one of the areas of research that our faculty are working on is, because you mentioned your first slide, data and knowledge. And when you talk data, now the new oil is data. It's very important. And we have been approached with many entities in the smart agriculture for Internet of Things, sensing technology, computer vision, to have cameras with thermal cameras, with hyperspectral camera that collect terabyte of data every day. So how you can process this data and you can optimize your production. So we have a dedicated team working with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in implementing those technology in large-scale smart agriculture. And this is, I think, it's very important to leverage on this relationship. I think take advantage as well of the advances made here in Israel and Israel technology innovator, and then how we can implement them and adapt them to the needs of UAE as a country and the region as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating. Unintentionally, you mentioned something that's very close to my heart, and that is water leakage. I've had a company that's done massive projects in the world of water leakage. Many people don't know that most water utilities leak, on average, between 30 to 60% of their water. And it was mentioned today a lot in agriculture, and I want to take that to some of the food security issues we're dealing with. A lot of us right now are very busy with deciding which projects to initiate that are going to help us make more food, grow more food. But the water leakage percentage is not rare to big industry. The food loss in the agriculture industry is still staggering today. On average, across the developing world, it is 40% of food is lost somewhere in the process, from seed through growth to harvest to post-harvest to delivery. Imagine if we have the innovation that could actually reduce that 40% to 5%, 10%. Imagine how much food we would already be saving without having to actually initiate any new projects, just simply by optimizing the operational excellence of our own. And that is a lot of what ESG is coming to do. It's essentially saying companies, because in the end it was talked a lot today, that agriculture is a business line. It is, and now we're holding those businesses accountable to their part of the burden. To say 40% loss is no longer acceptable. And so what innovation and technology are you going to use to do that? And I'd like to kick that over to Mr. Williams. As the fellow businessman on the panel with me as well, we both come from the background of entrepreneurship, and your initiatives to enhance equality of opportunity and innovation, especially for the young sector, is admirable in Liberia and beyond. I'd like you to touch a little bit on that, and also how will these new opportunities in the market come to play with the youth and the employment opportunities across the nation. Once it was considered that innovation could replace jobs, but we actually know now that innovation brings jobs. And how do you see that collaboration happening between the private and public sector?
Thank you very much, Emily. And I want to say thanks to the Director General for the invitation for me to participate in this conference. First and foremost, I would like to say that as an African, compliance with the ESG, we have no problem with that. It is a good thing. Every African wants some level of compliance because people in the West, for example, I worked for the US government for some time, about 16 years. When there's a spill, oil spilled in the US, all the lawmakers go crazy. The governors go crazy, the citizens go crazy. But when there's an oil spill in Nigeria, nobody hears about it. It doesn't even go on CNN. And then also, it is important to know that there are bad business people and good business people. If you do not compel compliance, the bad business people will get away free with all the bad things they want to do. So it is important to compel compliance. I also want to stress that the ESG, from an African perspective, what Africans want, particularly what Liberians want, and I'm from the region called the Mana River Union, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and the Africans. What we want is to get some social benefits whenever companies go within our region. For example, before I was born, there's a company called Firestone. Firestone has rubber plantation in Liberia. Right now, that operation is going down. But Firestone did not leave any major infrastructure in those areas. There were many companies that did exist in that area. They built shanty houses. Some of the houses did not even have bathrooms. The roads were not good. There are also a lot of logging companies in Africa. They go there, they just pull the logs, and once the logs are pulled out of the forest, they are gone. There are no roads. So what people want is that when you have a business, as a businessman or an investor, and you go in those areas, and you want to invest, you want to pool the resources, you have to leave something behind so that tomorrow, when the resources are no longer available, the people can still have some social benefits. That is why compelling, compliance with the ESG is very vital. It is also important to stress that the ESG regulation, all the other things that are not written from the perspective of the African. These things are imposed by America and Europe. And I'm an American citizen as well. But if the European Union sends a prescription to Africa, it doesn't fit. And sometimes some of these prescriptions are driven by advocacy group in these countries. And so these things hurt businesses that have true intention of actually helping Africans. If you have an advocacy group in DC or in Brussels that has a set agenda, they do not distinguish between the good businessman and the bad businessman. And so all of the imposition they have will affect the good business people in as much as they are trying to make sure that the bad business people do not carry bad practices in those areas. So this brings me to innovation. Today we are living in an age of knowledge-based economics. The big companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, these are not mining companies. These are not companies that are digging iron ore or diamond, but they have the most revenue. When you look at revenue, they have the most revenue. There are kids in Nigeria, in Liberia, that want to be like Mark Zuckerberg. They want innovation. They want technology. They want to become part of the global labor market. They want to stay in Nigeria, in Liberia, and work for the company in Israel. You can do that. There are folks who live in South Africa, live in Sierra Leone, and if you know Linux, you know Splunk, you know cybersecurity, you can live anywhere and work for any company anywhere. So innovation plays a major role, you see. And I'm a strong advocate of what Israel offers. If you look in Africa, most of the young people want innovation and technology, and they look up to two countries. They do not look up to America. They look up to Israel and Singapore. Singapore doesn't have diamonds, they do not have gold. But see how successful Singapore is. And see what Israel can offer in terms of feeding its people, transporting technology, and all the other things that they do transport to the rest of the world. So if we use technology and if we apply the different innovative methodology that Israel offers and that the rest of the world is partaking in, I think Africa will become a better place to do business. And the kind of businesses that will grow in Africa will not just be businesses that focus on minerals. You know, I have a friend here from Nigeria, right? In Nigeria, for example, they do mine crude oil. But many of the people in Nigeria sleep in darkness. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana, Ivory Coast is the largest producer of cocoa. But the very children who cultivate the cocoa, some of them have never eaten chocolate. So there are things that the big business company, the big businesses and the big investors can do to be able to make sure that Africa benefits from everything that they do. And so having innovative approaches, making sure that they comply with all the regulations so that the people can benefit, so that things like health issues will not result from the kind of business practices they have, you know, those things are very important because if a company goes to a place and the company leaves and the people develop cancer, they have different sicknesses because of the pollution, it doesn't affect the company, it affects the citizens who live within the environment where the company operates.
Thank you. All great answers and really thought-provoking. And I like how it is different in every country. And so I want to ask a futurist question in the sense. Now that we have an opportunity for corporations and government spending to be aligned on moving these types of indicators and goals forward, give me your ideal picture for each of your countries in 10 years from now. Well, a little less. How far away from 2030? All of our countries committed that by 2030 we would pretty much have these SDGs under wraps. It's a consensus that we're not on track in the overwhelming majority of them. But now with all of the sectors aligned and where companies are normally the number one offenders of some of these indicators and the damage caused, now that they would be in line to make a net zero or a net positive footprint on these issues, what do you foresee that your countries could look like by 2030? Dr. Asembo, you want to start?
Thank you. I have to say that Kenya is on the road to achieving its Vision 2030. And part of the Vision 2030 includes a very strong drive towards climate smart agriculture. I have to say that first we need to acknowledge that ESG compliance has challenges. And some of these challenges include the lack of standardization. We have the challenge of enforcement, because if there is no institution to enforce compliance, some of these things that companies are doing in terms of the indicators merely, they boil down to just beauty contest, where firms display their aesthetics just to be able to attract investment, just showing this is how beautiful we are. Of course, the cost issue is an issue that, of course, countries will have to deal with, because complying with the ESG requirements is very costly. We equally have to acknowledge the challenge of materiality. Materiality analysis involves companies, individual companies, making a decision on what they think is so important to them, and they can report on. And if it is individual countries making their decisions on what they think is important, it may actually lead to what we call greenwashing. Now, where do I see Kenya in the next 30 years in terms of ESG compliance? Kenya has put in place a number of measures and policies towards sustainable development. And of course, if we look at its commitment to COP26, by 2030, we want to see the net zero emissions and of course, a major shift towards clean energy. And so Kenya stands in a better position to drive the region, particularly the Horn of Africa, towards ESG compliance. And how can this be done? We see a lot of opportunity in public-private partnerships. There is need to institutionalize ESG so that it is owned by all the stakeholders in the chain. With the launch of the Kenya Green Bond Initiative, I see a lot of funding opportunities for companies. And already the Nairobi Securities Exchange is working on incentivization of funds so that they remain compliant. We equally see a lot of opportunities that can be driven through PPPs in communication and information sharing in terms of creating a lot of awareness. And we have to say that the World Bank has launched a number of innovations in place to help create awareness and link the multinationals and the farmers on the ground and enhance stakeholder collaboration. And so Kenya is a better place to drive the agenda, and I see a number of efforts being made towards ensuring that the farms in Kenya and in the region remain compliant, and Kenya will definitely lead the process in the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to add to my question as well, just so you can have the opportunity to answer as we're coming towards the end. What may also be the consequences, as we mentioned earlier, if we don't align with the compliance elements and where our countries might be on with the lack of compliance?
Well, if there is no compliance, I think the consequences will be grave. But equally so, if we do follow the compliance as provided by the Western countries, there will be an issue. Because what Europe thinks about compliance with environmental issues, social issues, and governance issues in Africa is foreign to the African, very foreign. And it is largely based on advocacy group, as I said. For example, in Liberia, our youth is based on self-taught civic education. They are engaged with almost everything that happens in the country. So the current mayor of the capital of Liberia is around 30, 31 years old. We have a lot of young people in government. And so anything you want to do, people question. You know, we have young people who are in ministry, assistant ministers and different things. The government may have issues, but in terms of civic education, freedom of the press, those things do exist in Liberia. So when an investor goes to the country and says, this is what I want to do, that individual, that investor is open to critique, is open to observation, examination, to see all the things that you want to do and what are the things will benefit the citizens of the country. So I think if that continues, and if the government and international partners can try to combine all of those different things with innovation and technology, it would make Liberia to excel.
Amazing. And you stumbled upon something that maybe wasn't addressed properly during the panel, but important for especially research institutions to know. One of the biggest confusion points and challenges, as mentioned in your paper, Dr. Asembo, is that there is no official standard yet in ESG compliance. It's a very confusing industry, meaning there's no one right framework. Imagine if the multinational companies coming to your country received the framework for activity in your country from you, and not from a European entity that decided what their indicators were. Meaning there's not only opportunity in the actual the outcomes of ESG, but there's even opportunity internally in each country, in each region. Potentially the Horn of Africa would unite together to say these are the sustainability indicators for ESG that we're expecting you to abide by because of A, B, and C policies that have been put in place, because of the difference in saying that it comes from us from within and not from you from outside. Dr. Ghedira, do you have anything you'd like to add to the comments already made on the future of what this looks like?
If we talk about the UAE and what they're doing, because I see more about the energy mix that is being developed in the UAE, and I see that we're on the right track. Now we reach 10% of electricity consumed is coming from renewable energy. Now also we have the new nuclear energy is being integrated in the grid and in the energy mix, adding more than 4.6 gigawatt of electricity. It will be the baseline and will be absorbing all the intermittents, because when your ratio of solar energy increases above certain thresholds, so the intermittence of your energy production will be affecting the stability of your grid. So it's important to add this nuclear mix into the energy mix, but take into consideration, because some studies classifying renewable nuclear energy as clean energy if you manage your nuclear waste well. But it's true, because when you go back to the solar energy, you know that we are located in desert environment, in dusty environment, and now we have a large-scale PV plant. The number one in the world is located in Abu Dhabi. It's about 3 gigawatt production. We are talking about million of panels, the size of 8 by 5 kilometer, all of them like solar panels. When you have a dust storm, so you have to clean them because the efficiency with the soiling, with the dust accumulation of the panels has a significant impact of your efficiency that go up to 40% reductions. So it's amazing when you calculate the carbon footprint of cleaning this panel, to bring all the laborers, to brush them, with the water jets, and all the energy needed to clean them, so it should be counted toward the energy footprint of your solar production. So there are challenges, but in terms of reducing the carbon footprint, in terms of energy production, it's progressing. And also now you know that the UAE will be hosting the COP28 later this year, and they adding now, there are a lot of programs that will be announced regarding hydrogen and green hydrogen production, and not just for the UAE, but to become like platform for, and this will be also the future of clean energy mix, in not just in our region, but also globally in Europe and the US as well.
Thank you. Can we get the last slide back on the screen for the close of our session? The takeaway, at least for me, is that there's something I wanted to put on a billboard, and here in the middle of Jerusalem, this was the biggest billboard I could bring to you. And during your trip here today, and the content that's been facilitated by the JCPA, you're going to realize something about this country. You're going to realize a lot of innovation, a lot of inspiration, and this attitude that we in Israel have of loving a challenge, because a challenge means that there's some sort of solution at the other end. And one of the things that you'll experience is this, and that there is no heavier burden than a great opportunity. And so if I come back to our poll, yes, it is a burden, and yes, it is an opportunity, but that's exactly the mix that we need, because creative solutions are the keys to situations like this. And so I hope that throughout your week here, you'll take advantage of this opportunity to be here among these participants in this setting, and to find the solutions for water, for energy, to have discussions on the collaborations on what solutions we want to bring to our countries and how we can implement that, including taking advantage of what's going on in the world economy at the moment. And the ESG revolution is indeed here to stay. And so the question is really going to be, what are you going to do about that burden and opportunity? So again, thank you to my panelists. Thank you to the JCPA. And if anybody has questions for any of the panelists, we'd like to open it up for the last 7-8 minutes that we have on the panel.
It seems to me, if I understand things correctly, we have a situation where the Europeans are basically establishing what the rules of the game are, and the African countries, not only the African countries, but in this context, the African countries, have to either comply or not comply. And our question is, are we going to comply, or are we going to run into scrimmage and have difficulties and so on? And I'm wondering if it isn't the role of us, the think tanks, to come back to the Europeans and say, we have our own ESG compliance program, right? These are our standards. We are not in a position post-industrial age of 150 years. We're still undergoing our industrial revolution. We still have an awful lot to do in terms of development, and we're not going to keep the pace of those that are creating the standards in Paris and Brussels, right? So I'm curious if it isn't the right attitude that we should be taking, not to say, well, no, we're not going to keep up with the European standards. We're not going to live up to the ESG regulations. We're going to create our own. And these are the things that we're going to put before the international companies. And this is the alternative that we're going to create instead of saying, niet. You know, we're not dancing at your party. We're creating another party. We have a different dance. Wouldn't that be the best approach to take? And don't we, as think tanks, have a job to do in that regard?
Gentlemen, anyone like to pick up? Grabbing for the mic on that one.
Yes, I think you are 100% right. And that's the point I was driving through, to say Africans think differently from the way the Europeans and the Americans think. And the issue is the way America and Europe think is not just limited to the ESG. They see Africa as a patient, and everything is prescribed for Africa without asking what sickness you have. So what you just said is that Africa has to find a way, individual countries in Africa have to find a way to kick back and say, no, this is what we want, give us what we want. And this is the reason why China is overtaking America and other countries in Africa. What China is offering Africa is not what Africa wants, but at least it is tangible. When the Chinese go to Africa, they ask the African, what do you want? Road? Yes. Okay, we'll build it. They do not give aid. They give loan. That's why African countries are in debt to China. The US gave billions of dollars in aid, but yet still Africa does not appreciate what America does. So you are 100% right. Africa has to kick back. We have to create our own standards.
Dr. Asembo, do you want to add something?
Thank you. You know, one of the challenges that ESG faces is what we call the politics of development of the third world countries. And the politics has got to do with the multinationals who actually finance the annual budgets of third world countries. Do we expect third world countries to enforce compliance on those multinationals who fund their budgets? That's why you see the Kenya Bankers Association actually decided to develop their own guidelines on compliance. The Nairobi Security Exchange has got its own manual on compliance, and what we are trying to see is a number of African countries now trying to domesticate their own compliance parameters as opposed to what the European countries are imposing. But the greatest challenge that we are seeing is that perhaps ESG compliance might be ineffective in some sense, especially on those companies or multinationals or government parastatals who simply say, we are contented with the way we are. If we expect firms to comply in order to get funding or in order to attract investments, what about those public companies or parastatals which are just contented with the way they are? You know, we are not performing. After all, we shall get support from the public coffers. We will still get financed, whether or not we comply. And so, what is this whole thing about ESG compliance? Is it just about those particular companies that want to get richer and richer? And that is why one professor of Harvard University said one thing, that in investing in environmental sustainability is a great idea to change the world. But it is a very difficult thing to do. And if an investor takes that direction, it might end up being poorer and poorer in the long run. They may not get as rich as they may want to be. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Oh, yes, go ahead. Well, last question. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, yeah. Here you go.
Hello? Hello? Okay, it's not working. So I want to make a controversial statement. ESGs are fine. I think really we must give them a bit more attention and encourage each country not to necessarily resist them or fight them. But I think it's a bridge too far when we create a situation where now we are requiring African countries per se, so I'm taking it from there, to be the ones to create them, enforce them, and effectively basically exclude people who don't live by them. It's a form of regulation, and to that extent I think it's good. Why I'm saying what I'm saying is this. Across history, no culture, no country, no people who are fighting to get out of poverty were environmentally sensitive. None, zero. I remember about 10 years ago, we were in the Aspen Institute and Al Gore was there. And he was then pushing his agenda, which I agree with. But I got up to ask a question and I said, look, the reason why we have the climate crisis today is because Europe burned fossil fuels to get out of poverty. And to a certain extent, you can argue that you are at a point where you've crested a certain threshold. And so it is possible for you to now start going down on that. But I can't do that in Africa. I don't have the luxury of having to develop green technology in Africa by which I am going to climb out of poverty. And I explain, I see people die from simple things. So I agree with you in part. We should accept the controversial paradigm that the standards and all those things will come from somewhere. It is not a problem for me that it is Cadbury that fights for children to leave cocoa farms, all right? It's not a problem for me. It's a problem that it happens, but it's not a problem for me that it takes some foreign companies to fight that. It is not Africans who fought against slavery. The fight against slavery started in England and Europe. My point is that across history, you will see this paradigm that really, when you are confronted with poverty and some of these existential, exigent problems, it really does not give you room to think about some of those other things. In short, the psychology of a man who is threatened by hunger is very different from the psychology of a man who has eaten and had his fill.
Thank you very much.